Hello and welcome back. I'm Nicole, a cottage witch, and today I'm doing a bit of a reading update. I'm doing the Tarot Readathon, which is hosted by Deja's Book World and Noelle 7 Pages, and there are a bunch of other people involved in the sort of managing of the different houses or suits or whatever you want to call them. But I'll link Deja's video at least below. They're also reading sprints by Museum Grec Reads and a whole bunch of other people. There's a Discord group and everything. It's super fun. But anyway, the idea is you pull a tarot card, and Deja has made prompts for all 78 tarot cards, reading prompts. And then you find a book that matches. So I've been doing that this month, so it runs for July. But I've also been doubling it up with a Read Around the World challenge. I have read 2 more books from new to me countries around the world. I can't actually tell if this is going to focus. Probably not. If Bahrain is on this map. As you can see, the gilding doesn't quite cover the where am I here? Haha, gilding doesn't quite cover the map properly, so I can't tell if Bahrain's there, but just imagine it's there and that I scratched it off. And then Togo. Trying to do this through a camera is much harder than it looks. At any rate, I'm scratching off Togo now, so that's exciting. Up next, I'm reading a book from Kazakhstan, so that'll be next. Very excited. Here goes Kazakhstan, although most of the book I read was set way over in this corner. But it's a cool country. And now I've read Algeria, which I'm actually surprised I haven't done before. That's weird. Unfortunately, the book wasn't set in Algeria, so there's still a couple other ones that I want to read, but I will get to that someday. And today I read a book from Qatar, so there goes Qatar. Today I read books from both the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. Today, whoops, if I can find it, there we go, Cambodia. And also Brazil, but this will take a while. And here goes Tunisia, which is amazing. So now, except for Western Sahara, from Morocco to Pakistan, I've read something from all of the Middle East. Do still have to get to the Caucasus at some point. So, first book that I read was from Tajikistan, which is The City Where Dreams Come True by Gulsifat Shahidi. It was pretty good. It was really, really short, and I wanted more from it. It's just, where does the Russian start here? 54 pages. It's 54 pages, and that's 4 short stories. So they're each just over 10 pages long, which is not very long. They're sort of connected by people who are related to each other. It was really interesting. I didn't know a lot about Tajikistan other than they speak a language related to Farsi or Persian. But beyond that, I didn't know much, and I don't know a lot, but it's pretty cool, this book, and it's just too bad that they're so short, and also that it's so hard to get books from Central Asia in Canada. The next book I read, I'm gonna run out of space pretty fast here for books, is Yummah by Sarah Shafei. This is the first Bahraini author I've ever read. Bahrain being a tiny little island in the Persian Gulf or Arab Gulf, depending on who you ask. So it focuses on Khadra. She is the Yummah. So it's her, she starts about, I don't know, somewhere between 12 and 15 years old, quite young. Is married young. And then her mother dies. And she has so many children really quickly. And then her husband leaves, and she has to figure out how to support 9 kids. and she does. And it ends, for a multi-generational saga sort of book, it's also quite short. It could have used more fleshing out. It could have used, frankly, an editor and a couple more drafts, because the quality of the writing was not amazing. But it was interesting to read. I don't know very much about Bahrain, so it's pretty interesting to read about. Yeah. Needed an editor, though. Seriously. The next one I read is, whoa, I've got my books out of order. The Silent Steppe by Mukhamet Shayakhmetov. I'm not sure I'm saying any of these names correctly, but I'll give it a go. And it is a memoir, his memoir, about living in Kazakhstan. And he lived in Kazakhstan during a fascinating and horrifying time. So it was, I'll find the table of contents here. Class enemy. So it started when they were still nomadic, the Kazakhs, and they were herders. They had animals, horses and camels and cattle and sheep, and that's what they did. And then they became class enemies because they owned animals, even though they were still what at the time you would have called peasants. But they owned animals, and therefore they became class enemies under Lenin. And so they had all of their animals taken away. They were forced into agriculture, which didn't really come naturally to them because they'd been herders for generations and also nomadic for generations, and they were forced into settlements. Although he moved around a lot. And then there was a famine. And I assume this is the same famine that hit Ukraine, but it hit Kazakhstan, and over 1 million people died. And it's, some of the stories in this section are horrible. Like, reading descriptions about people literally starving to death, not pleasant. So there's that. Also the war, the Second World War, which doesn't get any more pleasant. So it's a pretty harsh book. He had a pretty harsh life. He wrote it for his grandkids and his grandkids, so they would know some of this history. In part because I think he mentions at the end, a lot of it's not taught in schools in Kazakhstan, or at least it wasn't when it was part of the Soviet Union. So people just didn't know all these things once those generations were gone. So he wrote it down, and it's really, really good. Very glad I read this one. Then I read Mina Among the Shadows, which is from, why don't I have that on my list? Mina, I'll add it. Sorry, I've got a list of books below, and it's, this is from Togo, which I'll also add to my list. Whoops. Clearly really well prepared. I thought I was well prepared, and then I missed stuff. Oh well. Anyway, this author, he lives in Canada now. He wrote it, I think, originally in French. I think he lives in Quebec. Let's see, yeah, Mina Parmi les Hommes was the French edition. And it's set in Togo, and I don't know anything about Togo. Like, 0 things about Togo. So there's a lot of politics and religious conflict and things in here that I'm like, sure, I'll roll with it. I have no idea. I mean, you know, extremism is kind of similar. It's got some similarities everywhere. And also corruption has some similarities everywhere. So apparently there's a bit of both of those things, which is sounds unpleasant as well. But it's a really interesting story. I was vacillating between 3 and 4 stars, but I felt too bad to give it 3 stars because it's quite well written. But the most interesting parts are these little interludes where, let's see if I can find one. These ones that aren't really chapters. They're the interludes between the chapters, where the shadows and the old gods. The old gods argue with the new gods, and people may or may not be being punished for how they're behaving. And yeah, that's pretty interesting. But basically, it's a woman goes missing, and his friend who had moved to Quebec goes back to Togo to try and find her. And spends basically the whole book wandering around the port city. I can't remember what it's called. in Togo, and actually I'm not sure it's actually named. It might just be called the port. But I assume it's the capital city in Togo, or some, you know, something analogous to that. But yeah, there are plenty of options between disappearing behind the Muslim extremists and the veils they want everybody to wear, or the Christian extremists, or the government disappearing people who call them out on their corruption. There are options, and so he goes around to all of their friends. They're from their like 20 years earlier, and there's some of it's memories of what happened then, and then some of it's what he currently does in the present. And so the structure is really quite cool. It was an interesting story. And then I read The Swallows of Kabul. So this was my first book by an author from Algeria. However, it's not set in Algeria, and I really do like reading books from the Middle East or North Africa. So I do want to read, I want to read Albert Camus' The Stranger. However, he's really French, not Algerian. And there is, I forgot his first name now, Daoud is his last name. He wrote a book that is sort of like, if you've read The Wide Sargasso Sea, is that what it's called? Which is the sort of rebuttal to J.R.R. It's a bit like that, from the point of view of the Arabs, when this Arab man is murdered in The Stranger, which sounds cool. So I'll read those both sort of one after the other. And then there's another book, Women in an Apartment in Algiers, that I'll read, possibly in French if I feel up for the challenge. But anyway, this author is from Algeria, and there's some disagreement as to whether the atmosphere here is whether it really feels Afghan. I've never been to Afghanistan, so I have no idea. It is not as powerful a book as like Khalid Hosseini's book, The Kite Runner, and then Mountains Echoed. It's just not. Those are better for books set in Afghanistan. But it is an interesting look at what it would take, and possibly how much or how little it would take for somebody to lose their grip on reality altogether in such a brutal system. It's very interesting. It's two couples and their personal problems, which, you know, are difficult enough to deal with when you're not ruled by the Taliban, which complicates everything by like 3,000%, especially for the women. And so yeah, it's a very interesting story. I'm glad I read it. I don't know if I'll read more of his books or not. We'll see. I'm not strictly opposed to it, but I might prioritize other ones. And then I read Lord of the Rings, Le Seigneur des Anneaux. Excuse my poor French pronunciation. I'm better at reading than I am at speaking, in both English and French, frankly. Anyway, I listened to the audiobook of this because I'm trying to improve my listening comprehension, because I can read it moderately easily, but I miss too much when I listen. I've got to get better at that. So I'm listening to books that I've read these several times in English, and once before. No, is this the first time in French? This is the first time in French, I think. And but I know the story well enough. I've seen the movies, I don't know how many times. And it's really fun hearing the dialogue in French, and then, you know, some of the more famous lines will come up, and I'm like, oh, hey, I know that one. So yeah, it's super fun, and I will read the next two as well, one of these days. And then the end of the first weekend was The Girl Who Fell to Earth by Sophia Almeria. She's from Qatar. Well, she's sort of from Qatar. I usually try and find authors who've actually been born in those countries. For some in English, it's really hard, especially if you're looking for women who've been published in English. Like Djibouti, there are no women published in English. Zero. None. I'll get to that in a second. I think she's the only Qatari author I could find in English and access the book in Canada. There might be ones published in French, I'm not sure. And I am working on Arabic, but I'm so far, from being able to read a book. It's ridiculous. Anyway, she was actually born in the US, but then she lived, I think she's about 3 or 4 years old, when she lived in Qatar for a while, and then she lived back and forth between the two places. So she finished high school in Qatar, and then went to university in Cairo. So I picked it for my Qatar because it's, you know, she is Qatari, she is American, she's both, and it's confusing. And this is the book about how that's confusing. The girl who fell to earth is the idea at the end that she feels like an alien. Like, she's not Qatari enough to be Qatari, she's not American enough to be American. She doesn't know how to describe what she's to people in Cairo. Being a teenager in the middle of all that is really overwhelming and confusing. And yeah, but it's quite a good book. I think it's quite well written. It was really easy to read. I think all the chapters are Arab star constellations, the broken eggshells. But I'd have to look that up for sure. She talks a bit about the stars sometimes and how they're different in both countries. And but yeah, that's pretty cool. So that took me to the end of the first weekend, and then so far this week, so I'm on Wednesday the 10th as I'm recording this. It'll probably go up on the 11th or 12th depending on the speed and reliability of my internet connection. But then I read several audiobooks. La Force des Femmes by Denis Mukwege, which is The Power of Women. And I've got this audiobook in English now because I listened to it in French. I missed too much. I really wanted to understand more. So I've got it in English and I'll listen to it again in French, I think, is the plan. And so he's from the Congo. He's the doctor, if you've heard anything about him, who worked in Eastern Congo, putting women who've been raped back together after they've been literally torn apart, sometimes with knives and guns and farm implements, and it's vile. And he won the Nobel Prize for this, the Nobel Peace Prize, and for his advocacy for women. And honestly, if more men were like this, the world would be a much safer place for women. He's incredible. I loved the book. I'm glad it's available in English as well, so I can read it in English and then go back and practice my French some more with it as well. And then I read Left to Tell by Immaculée Ilibagiza. She is from Rwanda. It's a memoir of the Rwandan genocide. And it's very, very Christian, which I'm not anymore. But it's really quite good. She's, you don't have to, what am I trying to say? She doesn't try and force her faith on anybody. She just talks about how it helped her personally survive. I think she lived 3 months in a washroom in somebody's house behind a cabinet. And this house was searched many times by the Interahamwe. And she survived. And one of her brothers survived, but most of her family didn't. And I think one of her brothers was out of the country, and that's why he survived. Anyway, it's really horrifying to read. Yeah, I mean, it's about a genocide. It's not going to be cheerful. It is disgusting. It's brutal. But it really does, like, I got to the end of it and it was like, you'd think we could learn more from this, just about how to treat people better. We seem to not have accomplished that quite yet, but hopefully one day we'll get there. And then I listened to First They Killed My Father by Luong Ung. She is Cambodian, so this is the Cambodian genocide. 2 genocides in a row. I've got to read more cheerful books next, because this was also depressing. She was 5 years old when it started, so it's a memoir, but it's like, she's been criticized for this, I think, and you do read it going, is this fictionalized memoir? Is this, because first of all, there's no way that a 5-year-old remembers everything in that detail, and second of all, she narrates some things that she wasn't there to witness. So she's trying to tell it from the first person for impact, which I get, but there's definitely an imaginative element to some of the parts of the story. But aside from that, it's quite good. It's I mean, as much as a book about such a horrifying time period can be good, it is. I mean, it's her, several of her siblings survived, several of them didn't, and her parents didn't. But it's the story. I mean, that's not really a spoiler because it gives it away in the title that they killed her father, at least. because he'd worked for the government, and so they were forced, everybody was forced to leave. Now I'm blanking on the Phnom Penh, the capital city where they lived, and forced into the countryside, forced into labor camps, and it's just brutal. People are brutal to each other. It's not okay. We've got to be better to each other, is the takeaway. And then I listened to and finished just today The Witch of Portobello by Paulo Coelho. This is another one of those books where it's the first book from a Brazilian author that I've read, but it's not set in Brazil, it's set in Europe. So I may read other books from Brazil. I do want to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is by a non-fiction book by a Brazilian author, so maybe I'll count that also for a book from Brazil later. But yeah, I mean, it was okay. It's a funny story. I'm not quite sure what I think about it yet, to be honest. It's very spiritual, mystical, which, you know, is fine. And I think probably pretty par for the course for Coelho, although I only tried to read The Alchemist once and couldn't finish it. So this is the only other book by him that I've read. But yeah, I mean, the main character was interesting. Some of the other characters were not so well developed, but the main one was pretty interesting. And then I finished today Une Farouche Liberté by Gisèle Halimi, who is the first Tunisian author I've read. Tunisia being in North Africa between Algeria and Libya. Yeah. She was a feminist in Algeria, or Tunisia, and then in France. When France, I mean, I think France was the colonial power of both Tunisia and Algeria in the early days of her career. She was a lawyer at a time when girls in Tunisia were not supposed to do anything career-wise, like nothing. And this is a book. It's set in a interview format. So this other person, Annick Kojon, asks the questions and then she answers them, and it's written down, and it's so good. It's so good. This was the prompt for this one was a 5-star prediction, and yeah, it was a 5 stars. Incredible book. I will definitely read more of her books. She was an incredible woman, fighting for women's rights at a time when it was even harder than it is now. Yeah, so go Giselle. She, I think, passed away a few years ago, but yeah, that's that. And then I've just started an audiobook, By the Sea, by Abdul Razak Gurna. He's a Tanzanian author. And I've never read a book from Tanzania. And then the other book I'm reading at the moment is, oh yeah, this is where I keep track of all my reading challenges. So I've got my Middle East and North Africa challenge, which is a Goodreads group, which is pretty fun. And then my Read Around the World, where I put in all the books from all the different countries. Not all the books, I mean, because obviously I've read like a gazillion Canadian ones, and I'm not going to write them all in, but... And then there are some books that I want to read and haven't yet that I've put in, so I don't forget. Anyway, sidetracked. The other book I'm reading right now is Les Enfants de Khat by Mina Hudan Ahmed. And this is literally the only book by a Djibouti woman that I could find in Canada in French or English. The only one. There are 0 others available. There's one Djiboutian, I don't know how you say that, Djiboutian? I don't know. Man who's been published. It was the United States of something that he published. I can't remember. Anyway, he's been published in English, but I think that's it for English. Other books have been published in French, but all by men. And so I got this one. I don't know if it'll be any good. It's got mixed reviews, so we shall see. I tried reading it in 2021, and this is how far I got, because it was just too hard for me at that point. So I'm gonna try again and see how it goes. And then, I'll show you my next up pile. So these are the books I definitely want to read this year that I've pulled off my bookshelves. And then these are the ones I've lined up for the next few cards that I've matched. So yeah, I think that's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.